Welcome to the launch of the APF's Regional Action Plan on Human Rights Defenders. My name is Amy Janowski and I'm the Communications and Networking Officer at the APF. We're really happy to have you all here today. I would now like to introduce our first presentation. Mary Lawler is the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. Ms. Lawler was unable to attend live today. However, she has kindly sent through a pre-recorded message.
Hello everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day to you from Dublin, where it's our National Day today. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you and for asking me to write the foreword to the action plan. It's heartening to see this kind of in-depth protection initiative take shape with such concrete steps to advance the Marrakesh Declaration and to assist the work of NHRIs in protecting defenders. As you know full well, the Asia-Pacific has become an increasingly dangerous place for those who peacefully advocate for the rights of others. Last week, I presented my report to the UN Human Rights Council, and I spoke about recent attacks and murders of defenders in Afghanistan. I reminded the Council about the killings of 2 staff members of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, Ms. Fatima Natasha Khalil, who was only 24, and Mr. Ahmed Jawed Folad. And they were both shot as they made their way to work. And actually as well, in 2019, another member of the Afghan Independent Commission, Mr. Abdul Samad Ameri, was abducted on the 3rd of September and then shot dead on the 4th of December. And I always remember, the dates where something nice happens to me when something awful happens to somebody else, because the 3rd of September is the birthday of 2 of my children. And it's always very poignant and sad when I hear of an atrocity on that day. My report highlighted that hundreds of human rights defenders are killed every year across the world, and many of these killings are clearly signaled in advance with death threats, but too often authorities fail to act before a murder is committed. The Council received my report politely, and in the face of such hard evidence, there was little pushback. Half a dozen countries from the Asia-Pacific region responded during the public dialogue about it with encouraging words. But we know a key driver of these killings is the impunity that surrounds them. States' failure to bring perpetrators to justice is a real problem. And we know with heavy certainty that this year is unlikely to be very different from previous years in terms of how many defenders will be killed, not unless drastic action is taken and political will is found to stop this happening. Your action plan is essential in this struggle to save lives. I've spoken to hundreds of defenders around the world, including many in the Asia-Pacific region, since I took up this mandate in May, and heard firsthand from them how they have faced increased threats to their security since the COVID pandemic hit. You are right to highlight that the need for defenders to work safely demands a collective and systematic response in terms of advocacy and program development from NHRIs and their partners. The plan rightly focuses on the risk faced by women human rights defenders, too often targeted for who they are as well as what they do. And it is right too to focus on support to defenders in key critical areas, including business and human rights, disability rights, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer rights, and the right to a safe and healthy environment. These priorities chime very closely with mine and with those I've set out in the mandate, with a strong emphasis on the most vulnerable human rights defenders. I am encouraged to see the commitment from NHRIs in the Asia-Pacific region in this action plan to pursue a protection and promotion agenda to support human rights defenders throughout the Asia-Pacific. We know that NHRI staff often place themselves at enormous risk in the defence of human rights, and we recognise and applaud them for the work they do. During my mandate, I look forward to working with the Asia Pacific Forum and its member NHRIs on the implementation of this action plan, including through supporting human rights defenders' engagement in the international human rights system. Mine is a people-centered mandate, and I am determined to try and reach and listen to defenders who are working in remote and isolated areas. At the moment, that has to be online, but I am regularly talking to many defenders who would normally struggle to access the mandate. And hopefully soon we will be able to travel and meet defenders in person. I will close with a request for help, which is a particular resonance for your region. My next report to be presented to the UN General Assembly will be on long-term detention of human rights defenders all over the world. Many of the cases I'm seeing are in the Asia Pacific region, and I would urge you all to visit the Mandate OHCHR website to fill out the short, and it is short, questionnaire to help me with this. I want information on defenders who have been or who are at risk of being sentenced to long term in detention, and your ideas about how to stop or reduce this from happening. Many thanks again for asking me to join you today, and I look forward to working with you in this continuing and vital effort to support human rights defenders. Thank you.
And thank you to Mary Lawler for providing context to the situation of human rights defenders in the region. We'll now move on to Kieran Fitzpatrick, Director of the Asia Pacific Forum of National Human Rights Institutions, who will be providing an overview of the Regional Action Plan. Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. This action plan that we're launching tonight, I think, comes at a really critical junction for human rights in our region. You know, across the region, as you've just heard from the Special Rapporteur, we've seen a fundamental deterioration of the rule of law and the space for public discourse and advocacy, the civic space for human rights defenders. And against this background, I think it's essential that national human rights institutions, civil society, the international community and defenders themselves all work together to develop a response to the unfolding human rights crisis that I think we're facing today. On top of this, COVID-19 certainly has been an unwelcome impact for the human rights situation globally. In our region, the pandemic has offered a convenient foundation for many governments to impose far-reaching restrictions on freedom of movement, speech, and assembly. In response, human rights defenders have had to develop new and innovative means to continue their work to avoid reprisals from governments and non-state actors. Unfortunately, we have witnessed some really terrible examples of attacks on human rights defenders in our region, and the Special Rapporteur gave particular reference to the staff of the Afghan Human Rights Commission that were killed on their way to work. I'd also like to particularly highlight that because it's a telling example that while national human rights institutions are the defenders of human rights defenders, they are actually defenders themselves. But more recently in Myanmar, only last month, the military's taken control through a coup d'etat, and of course we've seen the suspension of core civil and political rights and a really violent crackdown against protesters and human rights defenders who have taken to the streets in protest. And unfortunately, the scenario is not getting better. It seems to get worse by the day. But despite these challenges, we at the APF maintain a positive outlook for the situation of human rights defenders in our region through strengthening our partnerships with key civil society actors at both the regional level and the national level, and building what we think needs to be a sophisticated response to the deterioration of this civic space in the national context, I think we're going to be able to improve the situation for defenders in the region. So fundamentally, the APF's action plan is a symbol of our commitment to the Global Alliance's Marrakesh Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And according to this commitment, the APF Regional Action Plan contains a set of actions at both the regional and national levels to implement our collective responsibilities under the Marrakesh Declaration. These actions establish quite an ambitious agenda and will require significant work on behalf of the APF, individual member institutions, to improve the situation of defenders themselves. So some of the regional actions that we'll be undertaking include, number one, engagement with regional civil society actors and international partners in support of human rights defenders' rights. Two, facilitating collaboration between our membership on human rights defenders. Three, facilitating relocation and respite for human rights defenders at risk. Four, developing regional data on violations against defenders. I think it's the last issue in particular is going to be a really complex one, but a really significant one. And you've just heard the Special Rapporteur refer to that in her introduction, because it is a really important data reporting role to the international community. And at the national level, our member institutions will be undertaking a series of activities, including advocating for national legal protection for defenders, promoting gender equality and the mainstreaming of the recognition of human rights defenders, women's human rights defenders, developing early warning systems, including human rights defender focal points, rapid response mechanisms and other protection mechanisms for defenders at risk, engaging with the international human rights system, particularly the Special Rapporteur, and strengthening national networks of defenders. So the implementation of this action plan will formally commence for us on the 1st of July this year, from which point the APF will be working closely with its members and its regional partners over a 4-year period to implement the action plan. I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to review the action plan in detail to consider the impact of these actions on your own work. The action plan also contains some key cross-cutting principles that will guide the APF and their allies in the implementation and national actions that I've talked about earlier. Among other things, these include a focus on women human rights defenders and the gender dimension of reprisals against defenders, recognising the role of environmental defenders and the inclusion in the narratives of national human rights institutions and human rights defenders themselves. And the point that I made earlier about the position that national human rights institutions hold as both protectors of human rights defenders and as defenders themselves. So to develop this regional action plan, the APF convened a drafting group of representatives from 8 of its member institutions, which met virtually on a regular basis over the second half of 2020 to draft and provide editorial input into the action plan. The investment from our members was vital in developing the plan that was responsive to the dynamic and diverse regional context in the Asia Pacific. Can I just take this opportunity now to thank all of the members of the drafting group for their support. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the staff of the APF for initiating and facilitating that drafting group and developing the draft context for the plan itself. The Regional Action Plan also includes a number of case studies that our members provided on the work that they're already doing in the region to strengthen the protection of human rights defenders. These include the long-term initiative of the National Human Rights Commission of Mongolia to support the development of a national human rights defenders protection legislation, which is currently before the National Parliament of Mongolia. The establishment by the National Human Rights Commission of India of a focal point on human rights defenders and a rapid response mechanism to react quickly to crises of human rights defenders, and the national inquiry into the situation of human rights defenders by the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines. And indeed, one of the presenters today, Attorney Jasmine from the Philippines Commission, will be joining our panel discussion later on, and I'm sure she'll be able to speak much more thoroughly to that particular experience of the inquiry itself. These case studies, I think, are really positive examples of the work that can be done at the national level to strengthen the protection and promotion of defenders' rights. A key role for the APF will be to provide technical and other support to enable our members to learn from each other about the successes that they've been able to achieve, and also to learn from the mistakes that they've had, and to develop improved measures in their own jurisdictions. At the regional level, the APF will strengthen its partnerships with key civil society actors, in particular Forum Asia, whose executive director will be addressing the launch today shortly. We see Forum Asia as a really important ally for the APF in its execution of the Regional Action Plan, including on our regional advocacy, but also in its strengthening the available data and reporting on violations against offenders. So before I finish, I want to convey my gratitude again to the reference group of the external stakeholders that provided some really insightful feedback on the draft version of the action plan. These included independent experts, regional and international civil society organisations, partnerships with many UN agencies, but in particular the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and of course the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. A final thanks should also go out to the European Union for their support, financial support in the development of the action plan. So with that, Amy, I'll hand over to you to introduce other speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran, for that overview of the Regional Action Plan on Human Rights Defenders. We're now going to hear from Shahazad Akbar, Chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, who will talk about the situation of human rights defenders from the perspective of a national human rights institution. Thank you, Shahazad.
Thank you, Amy. I'm truly honored to be speaking to all of you today. Can you hear my voice well? Great. I want to first congratulate APF and all of us for the launch of this important action plan that can guide our work, the work of all national human rights institutions in the region. It was a very thorough process, consultative process, and I'm very happy to see it bearing fruit. We will definitely utilize the action plan to strengthen our own work and improve our own engagement on this issue. When speaking about the challenges that human rights defenders in Afghanistan face, I would like to start by talking about the challenges around recognition. A definition of human rights defenders that has been well understood by all sectors and by the Afghan government. We are really at that stage, especially where security institutions struggle to understand who is a human rights defender, what rights do human rights defenders have, and what kind of protections they require. So we have to have this constant process of engagement and education, both at the national and at the local level. And this has become more urgent as the security situation has deteriorated. We have more and more targeted killings, focused on religious scholars, journalists, and human rights defenders. We also have to improve our legal framework so that the definition of human rights defenders is included in the legal framework that we have. And then there is also enough protection mechanisms. The context in Afghanistan is also it's very difficult because especially with the recent targeted killings, this is not a new trend, but there has been an increase in it. Many different groups in the society are being targeted. This includes prosecutors, judges, journalists, religious scholars, human rights defenders, civilian government employees who are not necessarily judges and prosecutors as well, but people working in different sectors. And in this environment of fear, the Commission receives almost weekly demands for support from various categories of people who feel targeted and silenced. And some of them come to us and say, where should we go? Who should support us? We don't fit into that international definition of human rights defender. We may work for a government institution, but we are working on combating violence against women, for instance. What support mechanisms, resources is there for us to relocate, to utilize a shelter? How can you support us? So we are, especially in the past 2 to 3 months, we have been really overwhelmed with requests from support from different sectors who are being targeted, people whose lives are at risk, especially women, in a context where professional women seem to be targeted just for being professional women. There's a lot of expectation from the Commission to be a voice for these individuals, even if they are not strictly defined as human rights defenders. Earlier this month, Afghanistan lost 3 female media workers. These women were not working on anything controversial. They were not even journalists. They were in the dubbing department. They would translate or dub audios for TV shows. But they were targeted for their work. They were targeted because they were women, and they were targeted for their work. So this is the context that we operate in, and I wanted to share that context and the specific challenge that it creates for an institution like us, and the expectations, especially in light of the fact that we don't also have a clear definition and protection mechanism for human rights defenders. What have we had in the past 20 years has been an enabling environment for civil society and human rights institutions to do their work with relative freedom. This has created a civic space in Afghanistan. This has led to creation of a vibrant civil society. This has been made possible both by the legal framework that recognizes freedom of expression and values human rights, but also by funding and support and by international community. In the past 2 years, particularly last year, the increased violence, although the past 20 years, we always had conflict in Afghanistan, but in the last 2 years, with increased violence and with increased targeting of these sectors of the society, as well as with the reduction in funding and attention to Afghanistan, it seems like not only human rights defenders, but the bigger civic space is under attack in Afghanistan. And we are facing a real risk of closure of civic space, to which human rights defenders are, of course, essential. When a human rights defender in Afghanistan faces a threat, and usually these are direct threats, usually to their life. Especially if they're at the provincial level, if they go to police and security institutions, they're often not heard, and they're often not heard, or the response is not quick enough. So this is one thing that we are trying to tackle, to increase sensitivity to these threats and to increase responsiveness, to pressure to increase responsiveness. Most recently, a joint commission was set up in Afghanistan by presidential order, a joint commission on protection of human rights defenders. This followed the communication by Mary Lawler, and also the advocacy by Asia Pacific Forum, other institutions, regional and international mechanisms around protection of human rights defenders in Afghanistan. In response to this, our government formed a joint commission for protection of human rights defenders. While it's a first step, it is a very imperfect solution. The commission itself, we were included in the secretariat of the joint commission without consultation with us. So this has led to a range of expectations from the commission, but we don't have the infrastructure and the resources to sufficiently address this issue. It's also not an appropriate role for us because the commission is being chaired by the second vice president of Afghanistan. We have communicated this to the government, meanwhile, while also trying to use the commission as an opportunity to engage more forcefully with the judiciary and with the security institutions to A, provide more rapid response to human rights defenders at risk, and B, to end culture of impunity. We have lost over the years in the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission 7 colleagues. We have not had a full investigation of any of these cases where we have been informed of the findings of the investigation. The ongoing culture of impunity around killing of human rights defenders, but not only human rights defenders, journalists and media workers, civil society activists and religious scholars, has been a huge challenge for the commission, and it has been a huge challenge for the broader community. We have tried to figure out where this challenge comes from. We have talked to the police, Ministry of Interior, Attorney General's office, the Supreme Court, different institutions, and we have been sent from one institution to another saying that the weak link in the chain is the other institution, which hasn't taken us very far. So I think one of the lessons learned for us has been that when we are talking about a strong and independent judiciary, we need to look at all the links in this chain and try to make sure that the sensitization and the training and capacity building and political will is throughout the system. If the police is not doing its job well, we won't be able to, putting pressure on the Attorney General's office will not get us far. If the Attorney General's office is doing a good job, but the courts are not responsive, then it's again a failed attempt. I want to end by two specific recommendations in this very difficult time for Afghanistan. I think international mechanisms and regional actors like Asia Pacific Forum can help us by amplifying our voice on ending the culture of impunity in Afghanistan, ending the culture of impunity for crimes against journalists, ending the culture of impunity for killing and threats against human rights defenders. Additionally, we need to have international community to continue to invest on human rights in Afghanistan, both politically and financially. Sometimes when we talk about assistance and support, we really focus on financial assistance, but it's equally important that there is political support for civic space and for human rights in Afghanistan, especially in this uncertain moment as we are going towards a peace process. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahazad, for providing an insight into the situation of human rights defenders from the perspective of an NHRI. We'll now go to Shamini Darshni Kalimuthu, Executive Director, Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, Forum Asia. And she will be delivering a presentation on human rights defenders in Asia. Thank you, Shamini.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's hope this all works okay. Can everybody see my screen? Cool. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and listening to the presentations before me has been very sobering. So thank you for taking the time to be a part of this conversation. I have about 8 or 9 slides to share with you before my colleagues at APF will share a video with us. To lay out the background of my presentation, I'm speaking about HRDs and HRDs violations and abuse against HRDs in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we know from last year, the repression against human rights and human rights defenders has continued in 2020 and exacerbated by the pandemic. There has also been, as a result of this, increased harassment against human rights defenders across Asia. Forum Asia has logged at least 656 cases of violations against human rights defenders across 20 countries in Asia. And this has affected more than 1,600 human rights defenders, and these are the documented cases. The violations against human rights defenders are often left undocumented, especially at the local and community levels. So we see the 656 cases of violations have mostly occurred in big towns and cities and capitals. In the context of COVID-19 in 2020, Forum Asia logged 20% of violations that were linked to the COVID-19 context. And as we heard earlier from Shahazad about the vulnerability of media workers exposing mistreatment or demanding governmental accountability for the handling of the pandemic were disproportionately targeted. The right to freedom of expression is the most common type of the right being violated, and this made up nearly 70% of recorded cases. This provides us a snapshot of the violations in the context of COVID-19 when it comes to the nature of abuses and violations. As we can see, judicial harassment was the most rampant that Forum Asia found. We had 342 cases that were recorded. And this is followed by 279 arbitrary arrests and detention of human rights defenders, quickly followed by intimidation and threats, violence, as well as killings of HRDs. And who are the profiles? Who are the human rights defenders who have been affected? Media workers, 171 cases of human rights defenders who were targeted, made up the largest number and the largest profile of human rights defenders who were attacked. Women human rights defenders closely followed second, and other human rights defenders, other categories of human rights defenders included pro-democracy activists, community-based HRDs, students, NGOs, and NGO staff. And some of the human rights defenders may belong to more than one category. We heard the story of Fatima Khalil, both from Mary Lawler as well as Shahazad. Forum Asia has recorded that 85% of harassment was perpetrated by state actors. This includes Fatima, who was a donor liaison officer at the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. And it's not the first time, as we already heard, that the commission staff have been targeted. Another case of a human rights defender who lost his life that I would like to spotlight to you is Ronnie Villamore. He was a journalist in the Philippines and a stringer for local tabloid Dos Cantos Balita. He was killed for covering a story on a disputed property. The army and the police said that Villamore was a New People's Army or NPA member who allegedly drew a firearm, an accusation that was later disputed. He is the fourth journalist who was murdered in Masbate. Reflections on the APF Regional Action Plan. And thank you, Kieran, for the shout out earlier to Forum Asia. We view the APF also as a very strategic and important partner in pushing forward better protection mechanisms for human rights defenders in the region. And I'm glad that we're able to collaborate in this manner. The Regional Action Plan is certainly a good first step to push for better protection of human rights defenders in the region from different perspectives, including policy making, engagement with civil society, NHRIs, and human rights defenders themselves when it comes to the protection of human rights defenders. In terms of NHRIs, we are glad that NHRIs should be able to play a proactive role in ensuring that HRDs are able to operate in a safe environment. We are glad to know from Kieran's earlier sharing as well that the Regional Action Plan aims to strengthen the collaboration between NHRIs and CSOs on HRD issues on the protection aspect, as well as in advocating for better legal protections for defenders. One thing that we would also like to encourage here is for the exchange of best practices between NHRIs. So for example, the Mongolia National Human Rights Commission spearheaded the creation of the HRD protection law in Mongolia. And this could be a best practice that could be shared across the network. From Forum Asia's own work, active monitoring and documentation on the HRD situation is key. A proactive approach by NHRIs in monitoring the situation will enable precautionary measures to be taken in preventing potential harassment. This ensures appropriate protection measures are taken in response to harassments. One recommendation that we would also like to add is on the adoption of a HRD focal point within NHRIs, which we view as essential, based on Forum Asia's engagement with NHRIs as well as defenders. This involves the idea of having a commissioner who is focused on HRD issues with adequate resources at their disposal, which will help with meaningful collaboration and effective follow-ups. And in addition, adopting a HRD focal point at the provincial or regional level will also be really useful to ensure that those based in local communities are adequately supported. You will know the title of my presentation is Change is Possible, and it is. So I would like to share with you through my colleagues at the APF, a slightly happier story about how the work that we have done has led to meaningful change, and the work when the meaningful change meaning the work that we've done all together. And I've just seen Shahazad's message. Thank you very much. I apologize for the earlier mistake about her colleagues being killed by non-state actors. And so we're still unsure about this one, but we'll move on to the video. Thank you so much for your attention. And Amy, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamini. We will be sharing that video in just a moment. Let's see.
People started going out to the streets little by little.
Young people, in a sense, took ownership of their lives.
People showed so much courage, and I think that is what is needed.
Na patalsik natin ng diktador, nakita ng buong mundo na nagawa natin yun without shedding of blood.
Millions really went out to the street. The estimate was 3 million.
When women ask for justice, when women say, we will reclaim the night, when women say, I want a safe workplace, they are exercising their citizenship.
We had to create the enabling environment to let girls and women to live with dignity during menstruation. The dignity is first comes from the mind. We had to dismantle the mindset of the people.
People were already starting to move, and it grew. It grew and grew and evolved. It became a people's movement, not just for clean and fair elections, but for democratic reform.
我们常常听到一句话，就是前人种树，后人乘凉。那我只好当那个前人，种树，让后人乘凉。
Thank you so much, Shamini, for that look into the experiences of human rights defenders in Asia. We're now going to move to our panel discussion. Thank you to those participants that have sent in their pre-prepared questions. Answering these questions on our panel are Attorney Jasmine Regino, Director, Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, Shana Priyanka Ramadanti, National Human Rights Institution's Program Officer at the Asian NGO Network on NHRIs, Cynthia Velico, Regional Representative, United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Philip Wardle, Legal and Policy Manager, Asia Pacific Forum of National Human Rights Institutions. Thank you all so much for joining us today. First up, we have a question for Attorney Jasmine Regino. The Regional Action Plan talks about some of the initiatives of the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines to protect human rights defenders. Can you explain the Commission's HRD's work in more detail, please? You're still on mute at the moment, if you wouldn't mind unmuting. Thank you. Lovely. Thanks.
Okay, before I answer that question, thank you for having me here to discuss the interventions done by the Commission on Human Rights to our HRDs. The core mandate of the Commission on Human Rights is to investigate cases of human rights violations. In the years past, we were only receiving a handful or a few cases or complaints of violations against HRDs, but the present administration from 2016 to today, we have been receiving so many complaints coming from HRDs. Mind you, these are not individual complaints, but group complaints. We have docketed 96 cases of group complaints against HRDs, ranging from red tagging, red baiting, fabricated charges, illegal possession of firearms, and the like. So the Commission on Bank deemed it wise to conduct a public inquiry to answer all these complaints filed before us. The public inquiry was not rather adversarial in nature. The parties invited those what we call complainants, and likewise from the government sector, were invited as resource persons. They were invited not as a complainant, neither they were invited as respondents. So it was actually a 3-day activity wherein all parties testified before the Commission and Bank. After the termination of the inquiry, there was a report issued by the Commission on the national situation of the human rights defenders in the Philippines. It is actually accessible on our website, www.chr.gov.ph. It's an almost 200-page document. And we made recommendations to the executive, legislative, and judiciary. But noteworthy to mention is the recommendation of the Commission for the immediate passage of the Human Rights Defenders Bill, and the assertion that it is the prime duty of the state to protect human rights defenders. So aside from the public inquiry that we conducted, we also provide, we have what we call the Witness Protection Program of the Commission, wherein we provide shelter or sanctuary to what we term persons at risk, subject to assessment and subject to certain protocols. These sanctuaries that we call are scattered all over the Philippines. We also have what we call, or we also conduct medical examination, exhumation, and autopsy. As we speak, maybe you've heard about the Bloody Sunday, wherein 9 human rights activists in the Philippines were killed. So this one we are currently investigating. We deployed quick reaction team to investigate in the far-flung areas of Calabarzon region, and some were already requesting for sanctuary or shelter because they feel that they are now at risk, and some also were requesting for the conduct of autopsy on the remains of this activists. We also have, or it is still in its drafting stages, our early warning system on HRD, subject to the approval of our Commission and Bank. And in the Regional Action Plan, it made mention about the anti-terror law passed now in the Philippines. As a national human rights institution, we already filed our amicus brief to the Supreme Court of the Philippines. And just like as I said earlier regarding that, what transpired last Sunday, what we call Bloody Sunday, we are quick to issue press statements condemning these dastardly acts. And by the way, I heard about Forum Asia recommending a focal commissioner. In the Philippines, we have a focal commissioner on HRDs. And across the region, we also have focal persons on HRDs. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Jasmine. Our next question is for Cynthia Bellico. There's a well-known disconnect between grassroots defenders and the international human rights system. How can OHCHR support and facilitate access by defenders to the UN system so they can better advocate for their rights and raise awareness of their struggles among the international community?
Thank you. I'm just trying to find my, sorry, I'm trying to find my, my ability to put my video on. Here it is. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Well, thank you. First of all, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this important forum. I've had the privilege to work with APF as well as many of the national human rights institutions and human rights defenders across the region over the past 15 years that I have been with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Asia. As many of you know, one of OHCHR's main roles is to work closely with human rights defenders and to support them in the work that they do. Grassroots defenders are often those who have the most information on human rights violations that are taking place in their communities, but sadly are also those that are most often at risk and vulnerable in the work that they do. And they also have the least access to structures, both at the national, also at the regional and international levels that could support them in documenting and reporting safely on the issues that they experience. Indeed, much of the focus of OHCHR's work with human rights defenders, including as much as possible with those at the grassroots level, is to build their capacity to strengthen that engagement with the international human rights mechanisms. And we do that primarily through training in a number of areas, which include monitoring, documenting, and reporting on human rights violations, raising awareness and understanding the mechanisms themselves so that everyone can avail of the full array of instruments and tools that comprise both the Charter and the treaty body mechanisms. Also to be able to make submissions as often as possible to these mechanisms. And finally, to draft stakeholder reports, which are also sometimes called shadow reports, for both treaty body submissions, but also for the Universal Periodic Review. The other part of our work is to be a convening body. That very much is the case for most UN agencies. But for us specifically at OHCHR, we aim to facilitate meetings with human rights defenders, including those at the grassroots level. Sometimes it involves us actually going out, bringing different UN agencies or resident coordinators on mission to some of the more remote areas, but certainly bringing also people to the UN to meet with various UN agencies across the system. But also we do that for the diplomatic community, particularly if some of the defenders don't have that direct access themselves. I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to respond to any more details on this point at a later time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. We now have a question for Shana. You work with many grassroots defenders across the region who are under threats of reprisals. Many of those defenders don't trust their NHRIs to protect them. How do you see the APF and ANI working together to build that trust and strengthen collaboration between defenders and NHRIs at the national level?
Right. Thank you, Amy. And first of all, once again, thank you, APF and everyone for inviting us. Just to also kind of clarify, I guess there'll be a bit of confusion of like ANI and Forum Asia, just to clarify that ANI is actually part of the initiative of Forum Asia. It's a network of civil society and HRDs working specifically on NHRI's issue and strengthening NHRIs. So yes, on the question, yeah, first of all, I would like to acknowledge the concerns, from the grassroots. Oftentimes HRDs, they feel that they don't get the protection that they need from the NHRIs and feel disappointed by the action or even the lack of action from the institutions. But ultimately, ANI and our network, we obviously value NHRIs and see that NHRIs and civil society have strength, capacities, expertise, and experience, that can be shared for mutual advantage. So to build and to kind of foster that trust and strengthen the collaboration, while we see our role as, Forum Asia ANI, we try to connect and bridge between the civil society organizations and the NHRIs through APF and also even through our members' engagement with their NHRIs. And how do we do this? We do this through organizing dialogues and consultations with the NHRIs, discussions, workshops, or perhaps even trainings. Actually, this has already been conducted by our members and with our members. So for example, we've been hearing a lot on the best practice on Mongolia, on how they've been trying to push for the HRD law, and that is kind of the discussion that we also participate and work with our member. And then in Thailand, for example, we hosted a consultation with civil society, a very diverse set of civil society, which discusses, human rights issues and also looking at ways on how we could collectively strengthen the National Human Rights Commission to advocate for their rights, including for the grassroots defenders. And also in Indonesia, where currently we're together with the civil society and our members there, we're working with Komnas HAM and also other state institutions in pushing for a protection mechanism for HRD. So, we see a lot of these great benefits out of these inclusive and participatory activities. And we see that would be a good opportunity for it to happen in other countries as well. But in relations to APF, the relationship between Forum Asia ANI and APF, I think this is a great step. I think Kira would know, we've been talking about this for so long, and we've been working on, collectively pushing for this ever since the Marrakesh Declaration. So it's a great first step. And we recently had our regional consultation, ANI's regional consultation, where we also prioritize our work, our regional advocacy on implementing these action plans with our respective NHRI. So, we really look forward to further collaborating with APF on this.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Shana. Now moving on with a question for Philip Wardle. The APF is planning to engage with intergovernmental mechanisms as part of its commitment to strengthen regional policy making on human rights defenders. Many of these mechanisms lack a fundamental awareness of human rights or represent governments with a poor track record of protecting human rights defenders. How will the APF be able to effectively work with such mechanisms to improve their protection of defenders?
Thanks very much, Amy, for that question. Before I go on, I just wanted to thank everyone that's joined the call today. We've heard some incredible presentations, both from our members, but also from other stakeholders external to the APF, and a lot of whom were involved in the drafting process for the regional action plan. So I just want to extend my thanks to everyone that's joined today. In terms of APF's engagement with intergovernmental mechanisms, I think it's important to set a bit of context for our region and the uniqueness of the Asia Pacific, in that unlike our counterparts in Africa, Europe, and the Americas, we don't have an overarching institutional framework architecture through which rights can be enforced at the regional level. So it's in that space that we need to operate at the APF, which presents a whole range of challenges, obviously, for us. But and also in terms of the international government mechanisms that exist in our region, they also don't exist across the full breadth of the APF. I mean, we have a lot of what we call sub-regional groupings. So for instance, ASEAN, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, SAARC in South Asia, which for us as a really pan-Asia Pacific organization also presents challenges in terms of the right audience for advocacy and international engagement. But look, given that absence of concrete institutional architecture regionally, these intergovernmental mechanisms are very important, both in terms of targets for human rights advocacy, but also engagement between productive engagement between our members, and you know, to facilitate their work at a regional level. So the APF has started working with some mechanisms in the region, and that's particularly with ICHA, the Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and also the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. This isn't a specific human rights defenders initiative. It's built around, it's designed around building engagement between national human rights institutions and those mechanisms on key human rights areas. It's in a fairly early stage of development, but we see this initiative as a really important step in building that awareness among international governmental mechanisms of human rights across the region. And I think it's through that sort of engagement that we'll be able to strengthen an awareness of defenders, and hopefully, hopefully among those representatives particularly in ICHA and the Pacific Islands Forum, you know, build relationships between national institutions and these mechanisms as audiences for advocacy. We've heard it from both from Shana and from Shamini as well about the sort of the coalition building that seems to be growing between our organizations. And I think doing that on a regional level with in the space with these intergovernmental mechanisms, and I know, Shana, for instance, in your space, that would be principally ICHA. I think it's a real area for growth for that cooperative partnership between the APF and ANI. So I'm looking forward over the next 4 years to really building on that relationship, with ICHA. I'll leave it there, but thanks again for the question, and thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Our next question is another one for Cynthia. The current situation for human rights defenders is getting worse in many countries across the region. Could you talk about some of the advocacy work that OHCHR and more broadly the UN is doing across the region with governments to improve the treatment of defenders?
Certainly. Indeed, the situation for human rights defenders has worsened. We heard that from Mary, the Special Rapporteur, as she spoke very clearly about some of the risks that are going on throughout the region, which are deeply disturbing and of concern. I think that what we see in addition to the increasing restrictions on space is ongoing moves by too many countries actually to criminalize the work of defenders, and also to curtail fundamental rights. And by that I mean freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. As many may know, OHCHR has different types of presences across the region. And unlike many of the UN agencies, we have very few country presences. We have indeed in the region 2 regional offices, both in Southeast Asia, which I am part of, and also in the Pacific region, we have a separate regional office. We have 1 country office that's in Cambodia, and we have, and it's actually our only country office in the region. And we have a number of human rights advisors, but very few that are OHCHR staff, but they operate as part of the broader UN country team. I'm mentioning this because really it depends on what type of presence we have in countries that will dictate to some extent the level of direct engagement that we're able to have. I think, that said, because we're so often and very much used to not being physically present in countries, as many, as I said, the UN agencies, of course, are, it has been imperative for us, in order to be able to work effectively, to develop strong relationships with governments and state institutions, but of course also with human rights defenders and human rights organizations. Our regional office, therefore, is often required to operate and work remotely with both governments, but also with human rights defenders in the region. And one of the key areas of focus for OHCHR more broadly, but also for the regional office regarding human rights defenders, is to advocate for the implementation of actual safeguards on the space within which they operate, both in terms of laws and policies, but also to raise key protection concerns that human rights defenders face routinely. Our job is to work with governments, with national human rights institutions and other state institutions to bring international standards into the work that they do, so that they can effectively address human rights violations, but also other types of concerns that have been raised with them or that are ongoing, so that they're able to strengthen their ability to uphold the legal obligations to which they are a state party. We also routinely raise emblematic cases so that we can bring a level of focused attention and response to the wider protection concerns that defenders face. Obviously, we're too small and too little present in countries to be able to do that in a widespread manner, but that is why we actually focus often on emblematic cases as those that we bring forward to governments. I wanted to just mention some of the key human rights areas of concern that we engage with governments across the region on currently, and that is definitely the issue of shrinking civic space, as well as I said, the curtailment of fundamental freedoms, something that is deeply disconcerting in our region, and one that the High Commissioner has spoken about routinely, both in the Council, but also in separate statements. Another aspect is the ability for everyone to participate, particularly with a focus particularly on those who are seeking to raise human rights issues of public concern with the state, because we know that they are most often targeted. But to allow for meaningful participation in all aspects of civic life. That, I would just like to note, is another very serious issue of concern in the region. I think it's true globally, but also in the region. And one that is very much linked to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals in the 2030 Agenda. And that's part of how we're raising this with governments, to say, you know, one of the most integral core elements of the SDGs and bringing that to realization is to allow for meaningful participation. And we see that very much in terms of the development of laws and policies, but also public and private projects that are going on across countries. The governments really look to stifle the ability or to undermine the ability of human rights defenders to be active participants in those areas of work. We are strongly advocating also with states to move to decriminalize the work of human rights defenders, something that is of great concern, ongoing concern in the region. And here I would like to make special mention of environmental human rights defenders who are regrettably increasingly targeted in our region. We work very much also with governments on issues that pertain specifically to women human rights defenders. We know that they face similar, we know that they, of course, have all of the concerns that regular male human rights defenders have, but they have their own set of concerns as well, and ones that need to be recognized and addressed by governments. And in that work, we very much look at their ability to access justice systems, both formal and informal. Finally, we continuously work with governments and state institutions to ensure that they are able to put in place protection architecture that will both proactively and effectively address the very serious protection concerns faced by human rights defenders. In addition to government and state institutions, I wanted to just take 1 minute to say that we also routinely advocate with human rights mechanisms that I spoke of before, including special procedures, the UPR and treaty bodies, because we are, as OHCHR, of course, secretariat to those bodies, as well as advocating with the broader UN family, as well as the diplomatic community, to ensure that they are both well briefed on human rights issues and developments in the countries, but also specifically on key protection concerns for human rights defenders. We call on them to advocate through their channels to raise the same issues that we are raising, and also, as I think the somebody said earlier, one of the speakers, to amplify our own voices, which is very much needed, and to link defenders as appropriate with many of the relevant mechanisms and stakeholders that are involved in protection. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Cynthia. We've got quite a few questions coming through, so we're responding to those as they come in. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but thank you so much for asking those. Our next question is for Attorney Jasmine. What are some of the threats and other challenges that the Commission and its staff have been facing recently as human rights defenders? Yeah, you just need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies. Okay. As far as threats are concerned, personally, I received death threats. I was tailed behind by a motorcycle riding man. I received hate comments in my Facebook account. There were also fabricated charges filed against me. And very recently, one of our commissioners was red tag as a spokesperson of the NPA, a communist terrorist group here in the Philippines, and also our chairperson. And in the conduct of our investigation as well were being profiled. Their names and home addresses were being asked when they conduct investigation. So the one that red tag, actually, our commissioner, Karen Dumpit, was actually a high-ranking military officer here in the Philippines. She was called as a termite. And termite also to the commission as a whole. It's like we are destroying the government because of our mandate to promote and protect human rights. So it happened actually. We are receiving reports as the head of the protection cluster, having oversight function to our regional offices in the conduct of their investigation. I am receiving reports of the threats and harassments that they are facing. Also, as far as challenges are concerned, we are actually facing myriad of challenges because of the present political landscape here in the Philippines, which is hostile to human rights. So because of this hostility towards human rights, it perpetuates a culture of impunity, a culture of violence, just like what happened in the Bloody Sunday. And this one is actually taking a toll in the conduct of our investigation. In the years past, when we request documents to the security sector, especially the PNP, because the Commission is not a first responder in the conduct of case investigation. It is usually police officers. So when we request for documents, we are actually given a runaround. Before, they were using what we call this law passed here in the Philippines, the Data Privacy Act, wherein we cannot get access to these documents. So they changed it now because under that law, an investigative body is exempted from that. They changed it now. They are now using Executive Order 2 in the inventory of exceptions when we request documents. We actually had a meeting with then the chief of the PNP for us to have access to all these records, especially not only on the killings of HRDs, but also on these drug-related extrajudicial killings. Unfortunately, we were not given all these documents that we are requesting from the PNP, but we are still trying. As earlier stated, change is still possible. We actually entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Armed Forces of the Philippines on this data sharing on the documents that we need from them. And also we had what we call with the Department of Justice here in the Philippines, especially on this political violence cases and also the extrajudicial killings that are happening here in the Philippines. And because of the spike of all these cases, the Commission now is overstretched. Our special investigators now cannot anymore respond quickly to investigate all these cases. The PNP is saying that there are only 5,000 cases of EJKs, but it is much more. Our CSOs are actually saying that it is more than 20,000. And by the way, the Commission has 16 regional offices. So we are actually region-centric, but still it is not enough to really conduct all these cases because of the many cases that we are facing. So our response time really is not that quick anymore because we are overwhelmed, we are overwhelmed actually with all these cases. But despite all these challenges, we continue to do our mandate, to investigate, to protect, and promote human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Jasmine. And Shana, a question for you. ANI and Forum Asia already collect data on violations against human rights defenders for their own reporting and advocacy work. What added value can the APF and NHRIs bring to this work?
Okay, thank you, Amy, for the question. So, we see the mandate of the NHRIs, and NHRIs are very much well placed to document all these violations that HRDs experience. We know that, we've seen that NHRIs have the complaint handling systems. They're able to obtain data on the violations through that system, and then they could also engage with the defenders through the defender networks and with other civil society partners. So we really cherish the mandate and of the NHRIs to be able to collect all these different information and data. So for Forum Asia itself, we would monitor cases through our capacity, through online monitoring and tapping into the resources from our members as well. But as mentioned earlier by Shamini, we were unable to always document everything. There are limitations for us to be able to document all these violations, especially on a local community level. So in that end, we see through the mandate of the NHRIs, we see that the data from NHRIs ideally would be more robust and holistic, which would complement our work and be beneficial for us to support our members and what we're doing with our members. So this could be kind of like what I think a main key recommendation from us is perhaps for NHRIs to look into this to increase the capacity of their provincial or regional offices to be able to adequately and actively document the cases. As for APF, again, this is already outlined in the regional action plan, and we think that APF can help in supporting and ensuring that the NHRIs are able to proactively document and monitor the situation of HRDs. So how we envision, the APF could support what, include capacity building, trainings, and sharing best practices among your network with the NHRIs and staff on, how to document and monitor the violations effectively, efficiently against on the violations against HRDs. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shana. And a question for Philip. How does the APF help its members to advocate for defenders who have been detained or face threats of violence?
So just let me unmute. Thanks, Amy, for that question. I guess it's quite contextual, our work on supporting our members' national advocacy, and our current approach is fairly reactive. So as a membership body, I mean, we receive lots of direct requests for support from our members at different levels, and it really depends on the situation. Sometimes it could be in a particular case or an incident of a defender, or even perhaps one of that institution's staff members facing a severe threat of reprisals. And because APF plays a role as a bit of an interface between our member and the international community, we leverage the relationships we have often with international actors, sometimes those in country, for instance, UN agencies or other diplomatic missions, to do a lot of background advocacy with our members. And some of our members on the line today might have had experience with that support that we've done in the past. That's a sort of a background piece of work. Sometimes the response work is a bit more public. I mean, we do support our members with public advocacy statements against, or statements in support of the release of defenders, for example. That might be from the APF chairperson. It may be some work undertaken jointly, again, with our international partners or with the special rapporteur, other special procedures, mandate holders. It's a kind of a range of support measures that we deploy depending on the situation. We heard a lot of today about the importance of experience sharing across different institutions, and that's certainly another role that the APF plays to sort of facilitate that those relationships. So where and this is quite a different mechanism than that sort of, I guess, traditional advocacy, but where we know there's a member who's faced a similar situation before, that might have a lot of expertise in detention monitoring or working with detention authorities. We often make those connections between our two members to encourage them or to enter into a dialogue so they can exchange on best practices and how to respond effectively. As we've heard today, the situation across the region is deteriorating, or has deteriorated significantly over the past year, or since the endorsement of the Marrakesh Declaration, and I think that deterioration, both in terms of the violations against defenders, individual violations, but also this concept of civic space that we keep talking about, the shutdown of information exchange systems, that's really putting a stop to the work of a lot of defenders across the region. I mean, that context regionally demands us to be much more proactive from the APF. And you'll see a lot of this is built into the regional action plan. So when we talk about supporting our members better to respond to defenders, in detention or facing risk, that's where we can work at the APF to strengthen our members' capacity to be able to respond better. And there's a lot of different ways in which we do that at the APF. I mean, as some have talked about today, that's strengthening capacity through training and networking among members. Again, working collaboratively with our counterparts at civil society on perhaps on that training and capacity development of our members, but on a whole range of different activities. Another initiative that we haven't spoken about a whole lot today is facilitating access to relocation and respite programs. Attorney Jasmine spoke about one of the programs they're running nationally at the Philippines Commission, a witness protection program at the regional and indeed the global level. There's a range of these initiatives in place, but we found that there's not a huge awareness or uptake of access to those programs, and that's both among our members and also defenders themselves. So this is an area where we see the APF playing a much stronger role going forward, is facilitating defenders access to those programs through our members and through national human rights institutions as the situation deteriorates in so many national contexts across the region. One final thing I should say as well, just in terms of how the APF works in advocacy and supporting our members with their advocacy. Obviously, the situation, one of the key considerations with all violations or threats against offenders is ensuring that those individuals aren't placed at greater risk because of any intervention that we undertake. So from the APF's perspective, that's something that we always ensure through our work, and that might be through how we conduct our background advocacy at the country level with international interlocutors, but also other, across the board through all our work. That's really important. I'll stop there. I think that's enough for me, but thanks again for the question and the chance to speak.
Thank you, Philip. I think that may be all the questions that we have time for today. But thank you very much to all of our panelists for taking the time to answer these questions. I'll now pass back to Kieran Fitzpatrick, Director of the APF, for his concluding remarks and to close the meeting. Thank you, Kieran.
Thanks, Amy. And thank you to you, Amy, for facilitating the job. Really well done. And congratulations to all of our speakers and panelists. I really appreciate your expertise and time, not just tonight, but also, of course, in the development of the draft and your commentary upon that. And we really look forward to this cooperation moving forward. I think the comments that had been made by Forum Asia and Annie about the nature of our relationship and how it's being deepened and sustained, I think is going to have a practical manifestation through the implementation of this action plan. So something very much to look forward to. And also I was deeply impressed once again just about the current work that actually our members are undertaking. Significant work. I'm pleased that the sharing of best practice and what went right and potentially what went wrong is a feature of the action plan, and the ability, for instance, of our colleagues in Mongolia to push for national legislation on human rights defenders is a hugely significant issue. Our colleagues in the Philippines running a witness protection system, it's an extraordinary initiative that is unparalleled, I think, in national human rights institutions worldwide. It's a really significant issue. Our colleagues in Afghanistan talking about the targeting of particularly of women human rights defenders and the notion of the capacity of the institution to be able to deal with this. And that again was echoed within the Philippines. There's an extraordinary amount of work out there, challenging work. But I really look forward to our cooperation moving forward. With that, can I thank all of our participants as well who haven't had the opportunity to speak, but I've seen in the chat room have been putting forward huge amounts of questions. Look, we haven't, I have to say, been able to get to everybody's questions. I think there's about 3 or 4 questions still outstanding. We will get back to you on that. And indeed, if any other participants have questions of us that they haven't put in the chat room but would like to ask us, look, please get in touch. Either contact myself or Philip or Amy, and we'll get back to you with the details. And I imagine our colleagues from our national human rights institutions would likewise be available if there are particular questions about that work. And indeed, our civil society colleagues, I imagine, would also be interested in answering any kind of questions. Look, with that, I think it's been a really successful launch. The big work is now in front of us from the 1st of July. I think I need to close off. Can I just thank again the fantastic support we've had from the European Union in funding this initiative. It's just been instrumental in being able for the APF to respond regionally, and I would really sincerely thank them for their financial support. So Amy, with that, I'd like to close. Congratulations, everybody. Let's just put our hands together. Thank you.